The morning Orville Rhodes agreed to escort a woman he had never met across 40 miles of open Texas scrubland. He told himself it was just a job, the same as hauling freight or breaking a green horse, something a man did for coin and nothing more. He had been leaning against the hitching post outside the Dusty Spur Saloon in the small town of Caldwell, Texas, in the spring of 1879. Rolling a cigarette with the particular patience of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, when Sheriff Hank Dooley waddled over and ruined the peace of the morning with his habitual throat clearing, and his habitual request for a favor that always turned out to be considerably more trouble than advertised. "Rhodes," the sheriff said, "I got a situation." Orville did not look up from his cigarette. "Sheriff, your situations have a way of costing me something I did not agree to spend. It is a simple escort job. Woman arrived on the morning stage from San Antonio. She is heading to Laredo to meet family, but the trail between here and Harmon's Crossing is not safe for a woman traveling alone, not with the Calloway brothers ranging that corridor lately." Orville finally looked up. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with dark eyes that carried the particular wariness of a man who had seen the frontier strip away its romance and leave only its teeth. He wore a battered hat with a sweat-stained band, a canvas duster that had survived better days, and a Colt single-action army on his right hip that he hoped most days he would not have to use. "How far is Harmon's Crossing?" he asked. 40 miles, give or take. Straight shot down the Laredo road, mostly flat. 2 days riding if you keep a reasonable pace. You escort her to the crossing, put her on the stage coach that runs south from there, and you come back. Simple as breathing. "And the Calloway brothers?" The sheriff waved his hand in a manner meant to convey dismissiveness, and succeeded only in conveying anxiety. "They have been raiding supply wagons, mostly. 3 men with more meanness than good sense. You are well armed and you know that country. I would go myself, but my deputy is down with a fever and I cannot leave the town unattended." Orville took a long drag of his cigarette and looked out at the flat horizon where the sky was already beginning to bleach white with morning heat. "What does she pay?" $12. It was enough. Orville pushed off the hitching post, pinched out his cigarette, and said, "Where is she?" He found Etta Atwood sitting very straight on a bench outside the stage depot, a large carpetbag at her feet, and a smaller traveling case balanced on her knees. She was 24 years old, and she had the look of a woman who had decided some time ago that the world was going to be difficult, and had resolved to meet it without flinching. Her hair was the color of dark autumn honey, pinned up under a traveling bonnet that had seen considerable use. Her dress was practical gray wool, and her hands were folded in her lap with the deliberate composure of someone actively working to appear calm. She looked up when Orville approached, and her eyes were green, the specific shade of green that makes you think of creek water moving over moss, and Orville noted this and then immediately told himself it was irrelevant. "Miss Atwood," he said, lifting his hat. "I am Orville Rhodes. Sheriff Dooley sent me. I will be taking you to Harmon's Crossing." She looked at him with a measuring directness that he did not expect and that he found immediately both disarming and slightly irritating. "How long have you been doing this kind of work? Escorting ladies across the South Texas brush country, scouting, guiding, that sort of thing?" 8 years, more or less. "Started as a trail hand, spent 3 years as a deputy over in Uvalde County, done some guiding work since. I know the Laredo road well enough." She studied him for a moment longer, then gave a single nod. "All right, Mr. Rhodes. I appreciate the directness. Are we leaving this morning?" "As soon as you are ready." She stood up with a fluid efficiency, picked up her carpetbag, and said, "I have been ready since sunrise." He saddled his bay gelding, Pepper, and hired a docile gray mare from the livery for Etta. She mounted without assistance and adjusted her seat with the ease of someone who had been riding since childhood, which earned her a fractional raise of his eyebrow that she was too busy tucking her skirts to notice. They rode out of Caldwell as the morning sun was climbing, and the town's small collection of whitewashed buildings was throwing long shadows westward across the dirt. The air smelled of dust and sage, and the distant, faint sweetness of mesquite in bloom. Orville rode slightly ahead, watching the road and the low scrub on either side with the habitual vigilance of a man trained to notice things before they became problems. Etta rode beside him when the road widened and said nothing for the first several miles, which he appreciated. Most people, when nervous, talked to fill the silence. She seemed to understand that silence was not empty. It was she who spoke first, eventually. "Do you know why the Calloway brothers are working this road?" "Opportunism, mostly. There has been a good deal of freight traffic since the railroad put a spur into Laredo. Supply wagons, cattle drives moving south, the occasional payroll shipment. They have been picking at the edges of things." Sheriff Dooley made it sound as though they were primarily a nuisance. Orville considered how honest to be. "They put 2 men in the ground last fall outside Cottala. I would call that somewhat more than a nuisance." Etta's jaw tightened, but she did not look alarmed. She looked like someone updating a calculation. "I see. Thank you for telling me the truth. I have found that people tend to spare women the facts of dangerous situations, as though ignorance were a form of safety." "It never seemed that way to me," Orville said. She looked at him with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "No, it is not." The first day of riding passed through a landscape that was flat and enormous and bleached by the growing spring heat into shades of tawny gold and gray-green. They passed through scattered ranching country in the morning, crossing 2 dry creek beds, and one that still held a thin trickle of water where they stopped to let the horses drink. By afternoon, the country had opened further, and the scrub had grown thicker on either side of the road, the gnarled mesquite trees and prickly pear cacti crowding the shoulders of the trail. They talked in the gradual, careful way of 2 people who are both accustomed to guarding their words but are genuinely curious about each other. Orville learned that Etta was from a small town outside San Antonio called Helitz, that her father had been a schoolteacher, and her mother had died of a fever when Etta was 11, that she had spent several years helping her father run the small household and the school after her mother's passing. Her father had died the previous autumn, a fact she stated without elaboration, but with a brief quality of stillness that told him what the elaboration would have contained. She was going to Laredo to live with her aunt and uncle, her father's brother, who had a general store there and had written to her after her father's death to say she was welcome for as long as she needed. She told this plainly, without any of the apologetic qualifying that he had noticed some women applied to circumstances of need, as though needing help were a thing to be ashamed of. In return, he told her, in his spare and edited way, that he had grown up in Central Texas, that his father had driven cattle before the great drive slowed, that he had found himself at 18 unsuited for any life that did not involve a great deal of open sky and no fixed schedule, and had drifted into the rough and flexible occupation of frontier work, which covered everything from tracking lost cattle to occasionally tracking lost men for the county, sometimes against their preference. She laughed at that last part, a clear and surprised laugh that seemed to startle even her, and Orville felt something shift very slightly in the region of his chest, as though a door he had not known was closed had cracked open an inch. They made camp that evening under a broad live oak tree set back from the road, where the shade had kept a patch of ground relatively cool. Orville built a small fire and fried salt pork and heated coffee, and produced from his saddlebag a quantity of hardtack that Etta accepted without complaint, though he noticed she broke it into pieces methodically before eating, as though managing the challenge. "Is this the standard menu?" she asked. "Afraid so. I have some dried apples if you want something approaching sweetness." "I want them very much, thank you." He passed the pouch across the fire. She took a small handful and handed it back, and their fingers did not touch, but it was the kind of almost touching that you notice nonetheless. "Mr. Rhodes," she said after a while, "what do you do when you are not escorting people across difficult country?" He looked at the fire. "Not a great deal else, if I am honest with you. I have been doing this sort of work for long enough that it has become the whole of the life rather than a part of it. I have a room at a boarding house in Caldwell. I ride. I take work when it comes. I have not settled. That by choice. The question was direct enough that it surprised him. He turned it over honestly before answering. I believed it was for a long time. I am less certain now. She looked at him for a moment, then at the fire. My father used to say that a man who does not know where he is going will not know when he has arrived. That is either very wise or very discouraging depending on the day. He was a school teacher, she said, with that careful stillness again. He said most true things were both. The fire burned down and the Texas night came in with its enormous stars and its chorus of insects and the distant, hollow call of a nighthawk somewhere in the dark. They arranged their sleeping on opposite sides of the dead fire, each with a bedroll, and Orville lay awake for a while listening to the sounds of the brush for anything that was not what it should be, and finding only the ordinary sounds of a large and indifferent wilderness. He was also, he admitted to himself privately, thinking about the color of her eyes in the firelight, which had been less like creek water and more like old glass, deep and full of movement, and he told himself to stop thinking about it, and eventually, after a reasonable interval, he stopped. In the morning he woke before dawn, as was his habit, and had the coffee ready and the horses watered and saddled by the time Etta emerged from her bedroll, with the precise dignity of a woman who had decided that dishevelment was not a condition she intended to permit. She accepted the coffee with both hands and sat on a rock and watched the horizon go from black to indigo to the first bruised pink of morning, and said nothing, and Orville sat nearby and watched it with her, and the silence between them had already changed quality from the first morning, had become something easier and more inhabited. We should reach the Salado Creek crossing by midday, he said eventually. There is a small trading post there. We can water the horses properly and get some actual food. Actual food, she said. I had forgotten what that involved. I believe they have beans. I am prepared to be enormously grateful for beans. They rode out as the light came up gold and horizontal across the scrub, and the world for a while was beautiful in the way that the South Texas country could be when the light was at the right angle and you forgot briefly how harsh it was the rest of the time. The trouble began about 2 hours after they broke camp, and it began in the most ordinary way that trouble announces itself in open country, which is as a small wrongness that the experienced eye catches before the conscious mind has named it. Orville had been watching the scrub to the left of the road for several minutes, where the mesquite grew in a thicker stand along a shallow draw, when he raised his hand quietly and brought both horses to a stop. Etta halted immediately. She looked at him, and he looked at the draw, and she followed his gaze with the intelligence of someone who understands that when a guide stops and stares at something, the correct response is to stop and be quiet. 3 riders emerged from the draw at a casual pace, fanning out across the road with the practiced ease of men who had done this before. They were rough-looking in the specific way that distinguishes men who have chosen cruelty as an occupation from men who have simply had hard lives. The one in the center was the largest, thick through the shoulders, with a beard that had not seen scissors in some time and small eyes that performed a rapid inventory of Orville and Etta and their horses. "Morning," said the large man. "Quite a fine one." "It was," Orville agreed. "You would be heading south." "We would. We have set up a sort of toll arrangement on this road." "Very reasonable fee, in the interest of ensuring safe passage." "I have heard about your toll arrangement," Orville said. "I believe the 2 men outside Cottala last October would have found the terms unsatisfactory if they had survived to discuss them." The mood among the 3 riders shifted like weather. The large man's casual expression hardened. The man on his right moved his hand toward his holster in a manner that was probably meant to be subtle. Orville had drawn and cocked his Colt in the interval between deciding to draw and any external observer registering the movement, which was the particular skill that had kept him employed and alive in roughly equal measure over the past several years. "I would prefer," he said, in a measured and unhurried voice, "not to cause anyone injury on a morning this fine, but the math of this situation is fairly straightforward and I think you can work it out. I am going to ask you to clear the road." The three men looked at each other with the rapid, silent negotiation of people who are reconsidering a plan. The large one was clearly running the numbers, looking at Orville's gun and his steadiness, and then looking at his two companions and finding the total of it not quite what he had hoped. "You are a long way from help," the large man said. "So are you," Orville said, "and I am significantly closer to being ready." Another interval of silent negotiation among the three riders. Then the large man pulled his horse to the right, a motion that was neither retreat nor concession as he clearly framed it internally, and the other two followed, and they moved off the road into the scrub on the far side with a studied casualness that only partially covered the fact that they were declining the encounter. Orville kept his Colt out and watched them go until they were out of clear sight, then watched the scrub for another full minute before easing the hammer down. He turned to look at Etta. She was very pale beneath her sun-warmed complexion, but she was sitting straight and her hands on the reins were steady. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to be very all right in approximately 3 minutes when the feeling comes back to my hands." She looked at him. "You were very fast. It helps. Are they likely to follow us?" "Possibly. I would rather not give them the leisure. Let us move." They rode at a faster pace for the next hour, Orville watching their back trail with regular glances, until he was satisfied that the three men had decided the morning's mathematics did not improve with persistence. Then he let the horses ease back to a road gait, and he found that his own heart was settling from the particular tight readiness of a confrontation narrowly navigated. "Those were the Calloway brothers," he said. "Or at least 3 of them. I assumed." Etta had recovered her color and her composure with impressive speed. "I am glad you were there." "So am I," he said, and surprised himself slightly with how thoroughly he meant it. The trading post at Salado Creek was a low adobe building with a pole ramada across the front and a water trough that attracted a dozen flies for every horse that visited it. The proprietor was an old man named Augusto who had been on that particular stretch of ground since before Texas had been a state, and who sold beans, dried beef, canned peaches, and whiskey with the impartial goodwill of a man who had long since accepted that people needed all 4 things in roughly equal measure. Etta ate the beans and canned peaches with what could only be described as genuine enthusiasm, and Orville watched her and felt something warm and inconvenient working its way through him with the subtle persistence of floodwater finding the low places. "You look very pleased," he said. She looked up. "These are the best peaches I have ever eaten." Augusto would be glad to hear that, though they came from a can that has probably been sitting on his shelf since 1875. "Then they are considerably improved by the context." She ate another spoonful and looked at him with that direct measuring gaze she had. "Mr. Rhodes, you can call me Orville if you like. It seems practical at this point." She considered this. "Orville, what will you do when you have delivered me to Harmon's Crossing?" The question was simple and it should have had a simple answer, and the answer should have been, ride back to Caldwell, collect his $12, find the next piece of work. That was the shape of the job, cleanly defined. He found, sitting across a scratched wooden table from Etta Atwood eating canned peaches in an adobe trading post in South Texas, that the answer did not come to him as cleanly as it should have. "Ride back north, I suppose," he said. She nodded, looking at her peaches. "Of course." There was a quality to that "of course" that he could not entirely interpret, and he filed it away and thought about it for the rest of the meal, and through the resaddling and the remounting and the first few miles south of the creek, turning it over like a coin he had found in an unexpected place. The afternoon brought a change in the country. The flat scrubland gave way gradually to more rolling ground, low rocky hills covered in cedar and live oak, and the Laredo Road wound through these in a more purposeful way, following the contours of drainage and old cattle paths. The riding required more attention, and there was less opportunity for conversation, which Orville told himself was a relief, and which he did not entirely believe. They stopped in the shade of a cedar brake around mid-afternoon to rest the horses, and Etta climbed down and stretched with unself-conscious weariness, and then sat on a flat rock and took off her bonnet and pressed the back of her hand against her face. "Hot," she said simply. "Will be worse in another month." She looked at him with mock alarm. "You say that as though there is a next month in this country I will be experiencing." "Will you not be?" She set her bonnet in her lap and looked at it. "Laredo is considerably further south. I suspect it is even hotter." "It is." He unstopped his canteen and passed it to her. "Though it is also near the river, which helps in ways the brush country does not." She drank, handed it back, and said, "Have you spent time in Laredo?" "Some. Passed through on cattle work years ago. It is a trading town, very busy, a good deal of commerce between the Texas side and the Mexican side. It has the feel of a place that is happening rather than a place that has already happened." She smiled at that. "That is a very good way to put it. Caldwell felt like a place that was deciding whether to happen or not. It is being patient about the question." She laughed, that clear, surprised laugh again, and he looked away so she would not see whatever was happening on his face when she did that. They rode through the late afternoon into a country that was softening with the approach of evening, the light going amber and sideways through the cedar trees, making everything warmer and more beautiful than it had a right to be in the middle of a practical journey. Orville found a camp site near a rocky seep that produced a thin but reliable trickle of water, and they made camp again with the ease of people who had already done it once together and knew the shape of each other's habits. She helped him with the camp in a matter-of-fact way that he appreciated, not waiting to be assigned tasks but identifying them and performing them. She gathered wood while he unsaddled the horses. She had a small supply of her own trail food in her carpet bag, some dried biscuits and a wedge of hard cheese and a paper of coffee, which she contributed to the common cause without ceremony. Over the fire she said, "Tell me something true about yourself, Orville." The question was so direct and so unexpected that he looked at her for a moment before answering. "What kind of true thing?" "Any kind. Something you do not often say to strangers." He thought about it honestly, which was the only kind of thinking that seemed appropriate to the question. "I have spent 8 years being quite capable and quite alone, and I have told myself that the capability made the loneliness worthwhile, and lately I have not been entirely certain that arithmetic is correct." The fire cracked between them and threw orange light across her face. She was looking at him with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, the way you look at something fragile that you have been handed unexpectedly. "That is a true thing," she said quietly. "Your turn." She looked at the fire. "I left Helitz convinced that going to my uncle's house in Laredo was the beginning of a new chapter, a fresh start after a very hard year, and I still believe that mostly. But somewhere between San Antonio and Caldwell on that stagecoach, I realized that I was also frightened in a way I had not admitted, that I was going to a place where I knew almost no one, to build a life from very little, and the bravery of it and the loneliness of it were more equal partners than I had wanted to acknowledge." Orville was quiet for a moment. "That is a brave thing to say. You asked for a true one. True and brave are often the same thing." She looked at him then, and something passed between them in the light of that small fire, in the enormous quiet of the South Texas night, that was not yet a declaration or an intention but was clearly a beginning. He felt it the way you feel a change in the wind before the weather arrives, a shift in the air with a new quality to it that tells you the landscape of the next several hours is going to be different from what you expected. He was supposed to escort her to Harmon's Crossing and let her go. He understood this with perfect clarity, sitting there with the embers between them, and he registered it as a plain fact about his assignment. He did not yet understand, as he arranged himself for sleep, and listened to the nighthawk and the insects and the thin sound of the seep somewhere in the cedar, that he had already begun, in some irreversible way, to forget the second part. The following morning opened with a sky of brilliant clarity, and they broke camp in comfortable near silence, moving around each other with a coordination that had developed with surprising speed. Etta's gray mare had picked up a small stone bruise overnight, not serious, but enough to require careful attention, and Orville inspected the hoof and determined that the horse could walk out of it, but that they should take the morning at a slower pace. This suited neither of their schedules, but neither mentioned it with any urgency. They moved through the cedar hills in the growing morning, the horses plodding companionably side by side where the road allowed, and Orville found himself telling her things he had not planned to tell her, in the way that moving through open country sometimes loosens things that close quarters keep sealed. He told her about his 3 years as a deputy in Uvalde County, about a particular case involving a stolen horse herd that had led him on a 6-day tracking ride down into the limestone hills south of the Nooses, about returning with the horses and 3 very sheepish thieves, and the specific feeling of riding back into town having done the thing correctly, having not given up when the country turned hard. She listened the way good listeners do, with her full attention and without the anxious filling of pauses, and when he finished she said, "You love this country, even when it is punishing." It was not a question. He considered denying it and found he had no interest in doing so. "I do. It is honest. It does not pretend to be something it is not. You know what it asks of you. Unlike people," she said, not bitterly, just observationally. "Sometimes, though I find I am revising that assessment on occasion." She looked at him with the particular expression she had that combined amusement and seriousness in about equal measure, the one he was coming to identify as her most characteristic look, the look that said she was deciding whether to say the direct thing or the polite thing and was leaning toward the direct one. "You are not what I expected when Sheriff Dooley sent you over," she said. "What did you expect? Someone less thoughtful. Most men in your occupation, from what I have read or heard, tend toward a particular kind of rough simplicity, capable but not reflective. I have met most of those men," he said. "They are good at the work. So are you, but you are also something else." The something else hung in the air between them, and he did not pursue it, and she did not elaborate, and they rode in comfortable, charged silence for another quarter-mile, before she pointed to a hawk circling overhead, and asked what kind it was, and he told her it was a Harris's hawk, one of the few that hunts cooperatively in groups, and she said that was extraordinary, and he agreed that it was. And the conversation moved into easier territory, while the something else settled into the background, and did nothing as dramatic as go away. By mid-morning they had descended from the Cedar Hills back onto flatter ground, and the trading post country had given way to a more genuinely remote stretch of the road, where the only evidence of human presence was the road itself, and the occasional weathered fence post marking the boundary of some enormous ranch too large to see across. Etta had been quiet for a while, and he was giving her the space of it, when she spoke. "Orville, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you are entirely free to find it impertinent and say nothing. I have been trying to think of anything you might say that I would find impertinent, and I am not succeeding. Is there anyone, in Caldwell or anywhere else, someone who is waiting for you to return from this?" The directness of it hit him with a slight shock that was not unpleasant. He looked at the road ahead for a moment. "No, there is not. I did not think so, but I wanted to know rather than assume." "Why did you want to know?" he asked, and he tried to make it a neutral question and did not entirely succeed. She looked forward at the road and the flat horizon beyond it. "I thought it was relevant information." "Relevant to what?" She turned and looked at him squarely, and her green eyes in the full morning light were very clear. "To whether I was being foolish about something." He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment the 40 miles of this journey and the 2 days they had spent together and all of the conversations and the small things, the hardtack and the canned peaches and the fire and the hawk, compressed themselves into something he could feel the weight of. "You are not being foolish," he said. Her composure shifted, just barely, like the surface of water when something touches it. Then she faced forward again, and the slight smile at the corner of her mouth remained, and they rode on. The Salado Creek country and the Cedar Hills had given way by early afternoon to the particular flatness of deep South Texas, where the world felt enormously wide, and the sky seemed larger than anywhere else on Earth. And Harmon's Crossing was visible for several miles before you reached it, a scatter of low buildings and a water tower, and the cottonwood trees along the creek that gave it its name. Orville saw it from a long way off and felt something in his chest do something complicated that was not, as he might have expected, relief at the completion of a job. It was the opposite of relief. It was a specific and concrete reluctance that he recognized as significant precisely because he was not a man given to reluctance, was in fact a man who had organized his entire life around the efficient movement through each thing and into the next, never staying where he had not planned to stay, never letting a job become a situation. He realized with the clarity that wide open country sometimes enforces on a person, not the least bit interested in letting this particular job reach its designated conclusion. They rode into Harmon's Crossing in the late afternoon of the second day, under a sky going pink and gold, and the horses were tired and they were tired and dusty, and Etta had a smudge of trail dust on her left cheek that she was unaware of, and the stage depot at the center of the small town had a sign in its window that said the next southbound coach left at 7 in the morning. Orville read the sign. Etta read the sign. They both stood in front of it on the plank sidewalk for a moment. "I should get you settled in the boarding house," Orville said. "There is one just down this street. I have stayed there before." "Yes," she said, "that would be sensible." He carried her carpet bag. He did not think particularly about carrying it. His hand simply reached for it when she set it down to read the stage schedule, and she let him carry it, and they walked down the plank sidewalk of Harmon's Crossing in the gold afternoon light without saying what either of them was thinking. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Cordelia Frakes, who had the energy and organizational intensity of a woman who had decided that managing a boarding house was a form of civic service, and intended to discharge it with excellence. She showed Etta to a small, clean room with a window overlooking the cottonwoods and a pitcher and basin on the washstand, and she showed Orville to a room at the other end of the hall without raising an eyebrow, though she had sharp eyes that saw considerably more than their expression revealed. Orville washed the trail dust off himself and sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the wall for a while. Then he got up and went downstairs and into the street and walked to the south end of Harmon's Crossing where the creek ran shallow over flat stones in the evening light, and he stood there and thought with great seriousness about the job as defined. Escort her to the crossing, put her on the stage, go home. He thought about what lay on the other side of that job. Caldwell, 40 miles north, his room at the boarding house, the next piece of work. The reliable and undemanding continuity of a life with no one waiting in it. He threw a stone at the creek and watched the ring spread. He had known her for 2 days. 2 days was nothing. 2 days was not enough to know a person, certainly not enough to disrupt the shape of a life over, not enough to constitute anything a reasonable man would call a basis for anything other than a polite farewell and a safe journey. He thought about this with genuine rigor, standing there by Harmon's Crossing in the evening, and he threw another stone, and he concluded that the reasonable man's analysis was entirely sound, and also that it was going to be approximately no use to him whatsoever. He had forgotten the second part. Somewhere between the fire and the peaches and the hawk and the something else that she had declined to name, and that he had confirmed he was not denying, he had simply and completely forgotten that his job included letting her go. He went back to the boarding house and found Etta in the small parlor on the ground floor, which Mrs. Frakes kept well supplied with oil lamps and a few battered but respectable books. She had cleaned up and changed into a slightly less dusty dress, and her hair was down from the traveling arrangement and pinned more loosely, and she looked up from the book she was holding but not reading when he came in. "I was about to go look for the dining room," she said. "Mrs. Frakes serves supper at 6. We have 20 minutes." He sat in the chair across from her. The parlor smelled of lamp oil and cedar and the faint sweetness of some flower that grew near the window. Outside, the evening sounds of Harmon's Crossing went about their business. "The stage leaves at 7, she said. "I know." She set the book face down. "Orville." "Yes." "When you were standing by the creek just now," she said, and he looked up because he had not seen her watch him go. "What were you thinking about?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Whether I had made a serious miscalculation about the nature of a simple escort job." She was very still. "And what did you conclude?" "That I had, categorically." The color in her face shifted, a warmth moving under her skin, and she looked down for a moment and then back up at him with those clear green eyes. "I have been sitting here for 40 minutes trying to determine whether it was absurd to hope that you were not going to simply wish me a pleasant journey and ride north in the morning." "It is not absurd," he said. "I have known you for 2 days. I am aware of that. I am on my way to Laredo to begin an entirely new life. I know that too." She pressed her lips together, and then she said, quietly and very seriously, "Orville Rhodes, I have met men of very little substance who made their presence felt considerably more than you have in 2 days, and I am trying to be rational about what that means." "What does it mean?" he asked, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him. "I think it means I do not want to get on that stage in the morning." The something that had been building for 2 days across 40 miles of South Texas scrubland arrived now, not dramatically but completely, settling over the room with the weight of something true. "Then do not," he said. "Not yet." "And then what?" He had not planned beyond that sentence, and he found that the lack of a plan did not trouble him as much as he would have expected. He was a man accustomed to reading country as he went, trusting that the knowledge and the care and the attention he brought to a situation would serve him when the fixed plan ran out. "I do not know exactly," he said honestly. "But I know that I am not ready to watch you go, and I do not think you are ready to go, and I think those are 2 things worth saying plainly before the stage leaves." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, the full version, the one he had been given parts of for 2 days, and it was considerably better than the parts had suggested. "All right," she said. "Let us have supper first and then figure out what comes next." He laughed genuinely, and so did she, and Mrs. Frakes appeared in the parlor doorway to announce supper with the expression of a woman who had correctly assessed the situation from the first and was satisfied with its development. They stayed in Harmon's Crossing for 3 days. It was not planned. It grew from an agreement not to rush, which expanded into a genuine exploration of the small town and the creek country around it, and each other, the more elaborate investigation that neither of them had had the leisure for on the road. Orville showed her the country south and east of the town, the creek bends and the limestone outcroppings, and a particular high ground that looked out over 20 miles of South Texas in every direction. And she stood on that high ground and held her bonnet against the breeze, and looked out at all of it with the kind of focused attention that he had begun to understand was how she met things that mattered to her. They talked for hours, the conversations expanding into territory that the road had not offered time for, about books she had read and the irregular education a schoolteacher's daughter receives simply by proximity, about the history of Texas, and what the coming of the railroad was changing, and what it was not changing, about faith and doubt, and the particular quality of morality required to live decently in a country that was still inventing its rules. She was sharper than he had expected, and he was more uncertain than she had expected, and both of these discoveries pleased each other. On the second evening in Harmon's Crossing, he told her about his parents properly, not the outline version he had offered on the road. His father had driven cattle from Texas to Kansas on the early drives when Orville was small, a man who was capable and distant, and who died of pneumonia when Orville was 16 in a way that left the world correctly the same size but somehow less occupied. His mother had been a practical and loving woman who had kept the small ranch going, and who had remarried a decent man when Orville was 19, and who currently lived outside Seguin in a state of contentment that Orville was glad for and visited when the distance permitted. She told him about her mother, more than she had on the road. Her mother had been a formidable woman, laughing and warm, and with a talent for music that had made every evening in the Atwood house feel like something worth coming home to. Her death at 39 from a fever that should not have been fatal had been the kind of loss that reshapes the geography of a person's interior life permanently. And Etta had been 11, and had had to learn to be strong before she was entirely ready, which she had done, and which had cost her something she was still not entirely sure she had recovered. He listened to this with the complete attention that he had given the creek and the road and the country when it needed to be read, which was the only kind of attention he had, and she felt it, and it unmade something careful in her. On the third evening they were walking along the creek in the last of the light, and he stopped and turned to her and said, with the directness of a man who has decided that the uncertain path is nonetheless the only one that matters, "I would like to come to Laredo." She looked at him. "Orville, I understand that it is precipitous. I understand that you have plans that do not include a frontier escort who has declined to stop escorting you. I am not asking you to change your plans. I am asking whether there is room in them or alongside them for me to not go away yet. Laredo is not your home," she said. "Caldwell is not my home either, if I am being truthful about it. My home is the open country, and the open country extends to Laredo and past it. I could find work there. There is always work for a man who is good with horses and knows how to navigate difficult country." She looked at the creek. The water moved over the flat stones with its thin, clear sound. "You would come to Laredo, if you will not find it entirely unwelcome." She turned to look at him, and her face in the evening light was very serious and very open, the two things she was most herself, and she said, "I would not find it unwelcome. I would find it the opposite of unwelcome. I would find it something I am frightened to want in case it does not come to pass." "It will come to pass," he said. "You are very certain." "I am a man who has organized his entire life around the avoidance of certainty," he said. "I find I have arrived somewhere I am certain." She reached out and touched his hand, just the brief touch of her fingers on his knuckles, and then she pulled her hand back and looked at the creek, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the evening came down around them warm and full of cricket sound and the smell of the water, and it was very nearly perfect. They rode into Laredo on a Tuesday in early May, 1879, having sent a letter from Harmon's Crossing to her uncle informing him of the adjusted timeline. Laredo was everything Orville had described, and then some. It sat on the north bank of the Rio Grande in a compact bustle of commerce and culture, the streets a mix of English and Spanish spoken with the particular fluency of a place where two worlds had been negotiating with each other for generations. There was a market plaza surrounded by adobe buildings and wooden storefronts, a substantial Catholic church, two hotels, a train station that had just received its first regular service, and the particular electric feeling of a town that was growing faster than it could quite accommodate, everyone making something out of the opportunity. Etta's uncle, Marco Atwood, was a broad, kind man of 50 with her father's eyes and none of her father's diffidence, who met them at the edge of town with a warmth that was entirely genuine, and that expanded to include Orville without hesitation, once his presence had been briefly explained. Her aunt, Rosa Atwood, who was Mexican-born, and had the brisk organizational intelligence of a woman who had built a successful store and family in equal measure, welcomed Etta with an embrace that lasted long enough to say the things that arms can say without words, and then welcomed Orville with a directness that said she was going to assess him with the same rigor she would apply to any business decision, and that he should not attempt to be anything other than straightforwardly himself. Orville was straightforwardly himself, which appeared to satisfy her. The Atwood General Store was on the main commercial street, a well-run establishment that sold everything from dry goods and hardware to preserved foods, and the particular variety of items that the cross-border trade required. Marco had been thinking about expanding and was in need of reliable and competent men who could manage freight arrangements and work with suppliers. And by the end of the first week in Laredo, Orville had been offered and had accepted a position that was considerably better than he had expected to find, managing the supply and freight side of the Atwood store's growing business. He found a room at a boarding house 3 streets from the Atwood house, took his meals sometimes at the boarding house, and sometimes at a cantina around the corner that served a beef stew of such quality that he considered it one of the legitimate improvements of his present situation over his previous one. He and Etta saw each other daily, in the natural way of people connected through a household and a business, and in the more deliberate way of people who would have found pretexts to see each other if no natural ones had existed. In Laredo, their courtship grew into its proper shape, with the room and the time that the road had not provided. He took her to the market on Saturday mornings, where she discovered that her serviceable schoolgirl Spanish was better than she had believed, and where he discovered that she bargained with the cheerful directness that she brought to all negotiations, and that this was enormously entertaining to witness. She came to the store some afternoons and helped with the accounts, having a head for numbers that surprised her uncle and did not surprise Orville at all. They walked along the river in the evenings, when the heat had begun to break, and the Rio Grande was running green and wide in the low light. The river was the border and also something more than a border, a seam where 2 countries had grown into each other with a complicated intimacy that was still working out its terms, and Orville found that he understood this country better than he had expected to, in the same way he understood all open country, by paying attention and letting the land teach him. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening 6 weeks after they arrived in Laredo, on the bank of the river at the end of a walk that had been prolonged by mutual and unspoken agreement, the same way the walk from the stage depot to the boarding house in Harmon's Crossing had been prolonged. They were watching the last light on the water, and she had said something about the color of the Mexican bank at dusk, and he had turned to look at it, and then turned back and found her looking at him instead. And the 6 weeks and the 40 miles and all the careful, patient building of it compressed again the way it had in the parlor at Harmon's Crossing, and he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. She kissed him back with a fullness that told him everything he had needed to know about the something else she had declined to name on the road, and the river moved past them in its green, indifferent way, and the evening settled warm and fragrant around them, and Orville thought, with the specific wonder of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know was his destination, that he had never been less lost in his life. "You were supposed to escort me to Harmon's Crossing and go home," she said when they broke apart. She was smiling, looking up at him with those clear green eyes. "I escorted you to Harmon's Crossing," he said, "and then you forgot the second part." "I did," he agreed. "I have no satisfactory explanation for it." "I do not require one," she said. He asked Marco Atwood for permission to court Etta formally, the following Sunday, in the back room of the store over coffee, with the nervous directness of a man who respects formality enough to perform it, and is also simply a man asking permission for something he has already decided he will do his best to deserve. Marco listened to him with serious attention, and then said yes, with the additional statement that he had been watching Orville for 6 weeks and had seen a man of genuine character, who treated his niece with the kind of respect and seriousness that a woman of her quality required, and that he was glad for both of them. Rosa, who had been listening from the doorway with the entirely transparent fiction of having been passing through, said she had known from the first week that this was where the situation was heading, and that it was about time, and that she would begin making preparations for a proper announcement. The courtship was formal and also joyful, conducted with the dual quality of everything in their relationship, the seriousness and the laughter in equal measure. They attended church on Sundays and had dinner with the Atwoods after, long meals that extended into the evening, with the natural expansion of a family that was finding its shape. They rode out on horseback on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, into the brush country north of Laredo, where Orville showed her what he knew about reading the land, and she showed him, in turn, what she had been observing about the social and domestic geography of Laredo since her arrival, the intricate webs of relationship and commerce and trust that made the town work. He brought her wildflowers he gathered on those Sunday rides, the South Texas species that bloomed brave and brief in the spring heat, cenizo and huisache and the startling pink of the meadow phlox, and she put them in a glass on the windowsill of her room in the Atwood house, and they stayed there until they were dry, and then she kept them still. In August, he proposed. He did it simply, the way he did everything, without elaborate staging, sitting with her on the bank of the river in the evening, holding both her hands and looking at her with the complete and undefended openness that she had brought out of him from the second night, and telling her that he loved her, that he wanted to build his life alongside hers in this place that had become real to him in a way that Caldwell and all the drifting years before it never quite had, and that he was asking her if she would marry him because a future in which he was not doing everything he could to make her happy seemed like a significantly diminished version of what a life could be. She cried briefly, which he had not expected and which moved him considerably, and then she said yes with a clarity and a warmth that left no doubt about the yes, and he put a ring on her finger that he had bought from a jeweler on the main street of Laredo, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone that was simple and real, and that he had spent 2 weeks' wages on. And she held her hand out and looked at it in the evening light, with an expression that he intended to spend a very long time being glad he had put there. They were married in October of 1879 in the Catholic Church in Laredo, because it was Rose's church, and it was the heart of the community they had both become part of, in a ceremony that managed to be both formal and entirely warm, attended by the Atwoods, and by what seemed like most of the commercial and social network of Laredo, which had collectively decided to feel proprietary about their happiness. Orville had written to his mother in Seguin, and she had come down for the wedding with her husband, a trip she declared worth every mile the moment she met Etta, whom she embraced with the warmth of a woman who had been quietly concerned about her son's long singleness and was now considerably relieved. The two women got on with the easy affinity of people who recognize each other's qualities immediately. Sheriff Dooley, hearing of the wedding through the irregular telegraph of Texas frontier gossip, sent a letter that said, among other things, that he supposed he owed Etta Atwood $12 for the real value of the transaction, and that he hoped Rhodes would at least occasionally come back through Caldwell so that Dooley could take credit for the whole business. Orville read this letter out loud at the dinner table after the wedding, and the table laughed, and Etta shook her head and looked at him across the table with the full version smile that was still his favorite thing in the world. They made their home in Laredo in a house 2 streets from the Atwood store, a low adobe structure with a small courtyard where Etta planted things with the same focused intentionality she brought to everything she did. She grew herbs, and a struggling but determined rose bush, and a lemon tree that Marco told her would never fruit in that soil, and that fruited the following spring with what felt like personal spite directed at his pessimism. Orville built her a proper work table for the courtyard out of cedar planks, and she used it constantly, and the courtyard became the heart of the house. He had been right about finding his place in the work at the store. The freight and supply management of a growing commercial enterprise suited him with a precision that surprised even him, because it turned out that the skills of reading country and anticipating problems and making reliable decisions in the field translated with remarkable fidelity to the logistics of cross-border commerce. He expanded the store's supplier relationships, established reliable freight contracts with both the railroad and the wagon freight lines. And by the spring of 1880, the Atwood store had doubled its wholesale business, and Marco was talking about opening a second location. Orville managed the details of this expansion with the same patient competence he had brought to 8 years of frontier work, with the satisfaction of a man who has found that his skills are genuinely useful in a life he has chosen to care about. Etta taught. It was not immediately planned, but it grew naturally from who she was. The parish school needed someone to help with the elder students, the ones who were beyond the primer reading stage and needed more rigorous instruction. And Etta had been a schoolteacher's daughter and had spent years helping her father and had a natural authority in a classroom that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with genuine respect for knowledge. She taught 3 mornings a week through the winter of 1879, and by the following fall she was teaching full days, with the particular satisfaction of someone doing exactly the work they were built for. Their first child was born in September of 1880, a boy they named Daniel Marco Rhodes, the Marco for Etta's uncle and the Daniel for Orville's father, whose memory he had been reconsidering with the perspective that happiness sometimes provides for past difficulties. The baby arrived with the robust good health and immediate vocal opinions of a person who has decided the world is worth engaging, and the Atwood household treated his arrival with a celebratory completeness that left no doubt about the degree to which he was welcome. Orville held his son for the first time in the low afternoon light of their adobe house, and felt something so enormous and so simple that it did not require any words, which was fortunate because he did not have any that would have been adequate. He looked up from the baby's face to Etta's, where she lay against the pillows with the exhausted and luminous quality of a woman who has just done something tremendous and knows it. And she looked back at him with a warmth so complete that he understood, with the absolute clarity that open country had sometimes given him about the nature of things, that he was precisely where he was supposed to be. The years that followed were built of the ordinary materials of a life that is being lived well, which is to say they were full of small moments that accumulated into something large and real. Daniel grew into a serious, curious child with his mother's green eyes and his father's instinct for landscape, who followed Orville around the store and the freight yard asking questions with the inexhaustible appetite of a child who has been taught by a schoolteacher that questions are the point, and who could be found in his mother's classroom after hours arranging things on shelves with the organizational intensity of a small person practicing for future competence. The store continued to grow. Marco made Orville a partner formally in 1882, a ceremony that Marco treated with the seriousness of a legal document, and that Rosa treated with the seriousness of a family event, meaning that it involved a large meal and the better part of the Laredo business community squeezed into the Atwood house to congratulate everyone involved. Orville rode out into the brush country regularly, which was a need that had not diminished with the satisfactions of the settled life, and he took Etta with him often, and she had become a genuinely accomplished rider and a genuinely comfortable presence in the open country that had given them their beginning. On those rides they were still, as they had been in the beginning, 2 people who could be companionably quiet or deeply engaged in conversation with the same ease, and the quality of the silence between them remained what it had been on the road, inhabited and easy and full. In the spring of 1882, Etta became pregnant with their second child. She carried it with the straightforward practicality she brought to everything, continuing to teach through most of the pregnancy and informing her students, when she could no longer pretend the situation was not visible, that babies were a natural biological occurrence that they were all welcome to look up in the science books she had acquired for the school. Their second child, born in November of 1882, was a girl. They named her Frances Louisa Rhodes, Frances for Etta's mother, whose memory had always been a lighthouse in the Atwood family, and Louisa for Orville's mother, who received the news with a letter that arrived from Seguin in late November, and that contained, rather, a lot of exclamation marks for a woman of her general composure. Frances was born with a completely different temperament from her brother, warm and social, and immediately interested in every person who came near her, which in the Atwood Rhodes household meant she was passed between an enormous variety of willing hands from the beginning, and seemed entirely to approve of this arrangement. Laredo itself was changing around them. The railroad had brought a new velocity to the commerce and the population. The cattle drives that had defined South Texas were giving way to more settled ranching. The rough frontier edge of the country was being sanded down, slowly, by the arrival of more people with more permanent intentions. This was not simply change. It came with the particular injustice of the frontier that Orville had seen in pieces over his years of work. The way that the consolidation of land and law tended to happen in ways that benefited some people considerably more than others, where the Mexican landholding families who had been in the region for generations found their titles challenged, and their acres shrinking through legal mechanisms that were technically lawful and substantively unjust. Orville had seen this, and had recognized it for what it was with the directness he tried to bring to the true nature of things. Marco and Rosa had navigated it with the long experience of people who had been negotiating between worlds for their entire lives, and the Atwood store's success was partly a function of the relationships and trust they had built across both sides of that negotiation, the trust of the Anglo business community and the trust of the Mexican-American community that was the backbone of Laredo's labor and culture. Orville understood his own position in this clearly enough to be useful rather than oblivious, and Etta, with the instinct for justice that had been part of her father's teaching, saw it with the sharpness that made her the school's most effective advocate for the children who needed one most. She established, in 1883, a small library at the school, which she funded through a combination of donations she solicited with a thoroughness that people found it difficult to refuse, a skill she had apparently always had, but that had been fully released by the knowledge that she was working toward something real. The library served every child who came to the school regardless of family background or the language spoken at home, and it became, in its small way, a thing of genuine importance in the town. Orville was proud of her with a completeness that he tried to tell her, and that she received with the characteristic mixture of deflection and pleasure that meant it had landed exactly where it was aimed. In the evenings, in the adobe house with the courtyard where the lemon tree now fruited reliably, and the rose bush had achieved an impressive size that Marco was still pretending to find surprising, Orville and Etta had the kind of life that does not announce itself as happiness because it simply is, in the way that good country is simply there, without the need to describe itself. Daniel would be at the table with a book, or working at some small project with the pieces of wood and string he was constantly accumulating. Frances would be engaged in some social negotiation, with her dolls that involved a great deal of earnest dialogue and occasional arbitration. Etta would be reading or preparing her school materials, or simply sitting in the lamplight, with the quality of presence she had always had, full and specific and real. Orville would watch this from wherever he was in the room, the way he had once watched the horizon on the road for things that needed to be seen. And what he saw was everything he had been traveling toward in the 8 years of open road before Caldwell and the spring morning and the woman on the bench, outside the stage depot with her carpetbag at her feet, and her hands folded with that careful composure. He had been supposed to escort her to the next town and let her go. He had escorted her, thoroughly and with complete professional competence, 40 miles through South Texas brush country, past the Calloway brothers, over the Cedar Hills and through the Creek country and into Harmon's Crossing. And then he had forgotten the second part entirely, with a thoroughness and a permanence that he regarded, in the full knowledge of everything that had followed, as the finest oversight of his life. There was one more chapter of the story that the story required, which arrived in the summer of 1884, in the form of a problem that came to find Orville the way problems in South Texas had always found him, without much warning and requiring a response. It was Tamaz, one of the young freight drivers who worked for the store, who brought the word. He came in from a supply run with 2 bullet holes in the wagon and a story about 3 men on the Laredo Road north of town, specifically on the stretch near the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick and the road curved, who had attempted to relieve him of the freight and had been persuaded not to by the fact that he had driven through them at full speed and not stopped until he reached the store. Orville listened to this and felt the specific alert stillness that the road had always produced in him, and then he asked Tamaz what the 3 men had looked like, and Tamaz described a large bearded man and 2 companions, and Orville recognized the description with the grim recognition of an old acquaintance. The Calloway brothers, or the remnant of them, had apparently ranged south. He went to the town marshal that afternoon, a competent man named Valerio Gutierrez, who had the trust of both communities in Laredo because he was scrupulously fair, and because he had been in the territory long enough to understand its complexity. Orville laid out what he knew, the Caldwell Road incident from 1879 and the current description and the location, and Gutierrez organized a party of 4 men including Orville, who knew the road and the habits of the men in question. Etta knew where he was going. He told her plainly, the way he always told her the true nature of things, and she received it with the composure that she had demonstrated on the road when they were 5 years younger, and she had held her hands steady on the reins while Orville stared down 3 armed men. "Come back," she said. "I will," he said. He came back the following evening. The Calloway brothers, reduced to 2 by the years, had been apprehended without the violence that the situation had seemed to threaten, which Orville considered a satisfactory outcome. The large man, whose name turned out to be Clem Calloway, had looked at Orville across the drawn guns of a well-positioned posse and made the same calculation he had made on the Caldwell Road 5 years earlier, and had arrived at the same answer, and had put his hands up. They were delivered to the federal jurisdiction in San Antonio, which had been hunting them for some time, and Orville rode back to Laredo with the feeling of having closed an account that had been open for longer than it deserved. He walked into the house and found Etta at the table with the lamp lit, awake, a book open in front of her that she had clearly not been reading. She stood when he came in, and he crossed the room and put his arms around her and held on for a moment with the specific gratitude of a man who has been reminded of what he is holding onto. "It is finished," he said. She held on in return. "Good," she said. "Do not do that again without a considerably better reason." "I will do my best to avoid having one." She leaned back and looked at him with those green eyes that were still, after 5 years, his favorite thing to look at. "You are all right. Entirely." She touched his face, the brief specific touch that was hers alone, and then she went to the fire to heat coffee because it was what the situation required, and she was a person who identified what the situation required and provided it. And he sat at the table and watched her with the love that had accumulated across 5 years of daily life into something so solid and specific that it felt like landscape, like the kind of country that has always been there and will always be there. The kind you come to trust the way you trust the ground under your feet. Daniel appeared in the doorway of the bedroom in his nightshirt, having heard his father's voice, and came and climbed into Orville's lap with the practical directness of a 4-year-old who has identified what he wants and sees no reason to be indirect about it. And Orville held his son and drank the coffee his wife brought him and sat in the warm circle of the lamplight in the house that they had made theirs, and was wholly and entirely exactly where he meant to be. The years continued in the good way, which is to say they continued. Daniel grew into a boy of 7, then 9, then 12, with an increasing seriousness of purpose that made both his parents proud and occasionally alarmed them with its intensity. He was going to be a person who did important things. They could both see the shape of it even when the specific content was still unclear. He was interested in the law, in the mechanics of how disputes were settled, and how agreements were made, in the bridge that the Atwood family had always occupied between communities, and the way that bridge needed to be maintained with care and good faith. Frances grew into a girl of 5, then 7, then 9, with a warmth and a social intelligence that made her the center of every room she entered without any apparent effort or intent. She was going to be someone who held people together. This was also visible early, and was also a source of parental pride of the specific kind that comes from watching a child be the truest version of themselves. Rosa and Marco remained central to their lives in the way of family that has chosen each other, which is the most durable kind. Marco's health had some difficulty in the mid-1880s, a persistent cough that worried the family through the winter of 1885, but he recovered in the spring and was subsequently more careful about working in the damp and more willing to let Orville and the younger staff manage the freight operations, while he attended to the customer and supplier relationships that were his genuine pleasure. Orville's mother and stepfather visited from Seguin in the spring of 1886 and stayed for 3 weeks, which was long enough for his mother to pronounce the house perfect, the children magnificent, the store impressive, the city of Laredo extraordinary, and her son's life exactly what she had always hoped for him, which statement she delivered to Orville directly, with the plainness of a woman who had waited long enough to say it that she saw no reason to be indirect now that she had the occasion. He received it with the same direct pleasure that Etta received his expressions of pride in her, deflecting slightly and then obviously moved. And his mother noticed this and was glad that the woman he had married had the same quality, the ability to both give and receive things truly. One evening in the autumn of 1886, Orville and Etta were sitting in the courtyard in the cooling evening, Daniel at his studying inside and Frances asleep, the lemon tree throwing its particular fragrance over the small space, and the stars coming up over the low roofline with the enormous clarity that South Texas nights could have when the air was dry and still. Etta said, "Do you know what today is?" He thought about it. The 14th of September. 7 years ago today, roughly, we arrived in Laredo. He looked at her. "Is that right? Give or take a week. I have thought about it a good deal today." She was looking at the stars. "I thought about that bench outside the stage depot in Caldwell, sitting and waiting, and how frightened I was, though I was doing everything I could not to show it. And I thought about a man who walked up to me and lifted his hat and said my name with a question mark at the end of it, as though he was not certain he had the right person." "I was not certain," Orville said. "The sheriff's description was not detailed. You were very serious. You looked like a man who was going to do the job correctly and then not think about it again. That was very nearly accurate. Very nearly." She looked at him. "What changed your mind? When did you know?" He thought about it properly, the question she had never asked directly before and that he had never had occasion to answer formally. "The first night. On the road. You said that people spare women the facts of dangerous situations as though ignorance were a form of safety. I thought that is exactly right, and I have never heard anyone say it plainly before." He paused. "And then the fire and the way you listened, and the morning and the creek. It accumulated in the way things accumulate when they are true." She looked at him with the full version smile, the one that still, after 7 years, was his favorite thing in the world. "I knew by the canned peaches," he laughed. "The peaches. You told me they were from a can that had probably been sitting on the shelf since 1875. You could have let me enjoy them without knowing that. Most men would have. You told me because you tell people the truth. That is when I knew." He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the courtyard of the house they had built their life in the city that had become theirs, under the enormous Texas stars, holding on. He had been supposed to escort her to the next town and let her go. The escorting had been done thoroughly, professionally, with complete attention to the route and the dangers and the correct management of all the practical details of the job. The letting go part had simply never arrived. He had waited for it, that first morning in Harmon's Crossing, when he stood by the creek throwing stones and telling himself to be reasonable, and it had not come. He had turned around and gone back to the boarding house and sat in the parlor across from the woman who was supposed to be a simple escort assignment, and the letting go had looked at the whole situation and declined to participate. He was glad, with the full and permanent gladness of a man who has arrived at the true shape of his life, that it had. He had forgotten the second part. He intended to go on forgetting it for the rest of his days. In this house, with this woman, with the children who had come from the fact that he had forgotten it. In the city on the river where two countries had been negotiating the complicated business of being neighbors for 100 years, and would continue to do so. In the open country that still called to him, and that Etta rode beside him into on Sunday afternoons with the ease and confidence of a woman who has made the road her own. He had come south to let her go, and instead he had stayed, and the staying had been the finest and truest thing he had ever done in a life that had previously been organized around moving. The lemon tree threw its scent over the courtyard. The stars came up in their thousands. His wife's hand was warm in his. He was exactly where he had arrived, which was exactly where he was meant to be, and he would not have changed a single mile of the road that had brought him there.